There's still a few folks joining us, but I'll get going with brief introductions and then they can join in when they are able. Hello, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Cassidy Monroe. I am with the Edmonton Public Library. I'm one of our community librarians, and I'm very excited to see so many of you joining us for Energy Talks. Just a little bit of housekeeping. There is a chat option, so if you don't have it open, you can click along the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions or tech troubles, I am your person. I will keep an eye on that. So if suddenly you don't hear anyone anymore, or you can't see the screen, you can pop in the chat. I also gave you my phone number in the email with the link, so feel free to phone me. I am your tech support for you and everyone else. As well, we are recording the event this evening. It isn't capturing all of the extra videos, so if you're on video right now, you're okay. It's just capturing the speaker, so right now it's myself. But it will capture audio. So if you ask a question later when there is a question period, it may capture your voice, or if you're speaking, it may capture your video. If you would prefer not to have that happen, just make sure that your either video is off if you don't want video, or you can pop your question in the chat and we'll ask it for you. With that, I am going to pass it over to Valerie Miller with Future Energy Systems to introduce our speaker and our series.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Cassidy, and welcome. I'm loving to see where everyone is coming from. So if you want to pop where you are joining us tonight in the chat, we'd love to see where everyone is. First of all, I would like to say that the University of Alberta acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. And tonight we are an online community, so we really want you to engage in the chat, ask your questions. We're going to be pausing about halfway through for questions and then again at the end. But to start off, for anyone who hasn't been at one of these talks before, I'd like to share a little bit of information about what Future Energy Systems is. So Future Energy Systems was launched in 2016 with a $75 million grant from the Government of Canada, Canada's first Research Excellence Fund, to help Canada transition to a low net carbon energy economy. We focus on multidisciplinary research that develops the energy technologies of the near future, integrates them into today's infrastructure, and examines possible consequences for society, economy, and the environment. We also contribute to the development of solutions for the challenges presented by our current energy system. And at the moment, we have 111 research projects, I believe 780 grad students, postdocs, and other highly qualified personnel, and 142 researchers, one of which you'll meet tonight. We do wish to remind current and future viewers that the opinions expressed by the speaker are not necessarily those of the Edmonton Public Library, Future Energy Systems, or the University of Alberta. If you do have to leave for any reason and you don't get to see the entire event, we will be posting it on the Future Energy Systems YouTube channel, so you can check it out there. If you want to share it with anyone else, it will be posted there. Give me a week or two to do any editing, but it will be there, I promise, along with lots of other content. And now to get right into our talk tonight, I would like to welcome Dr. Evan Davis to join us. He is an associate professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and specializes in water resources planning and management. His research focuses on numerical simulation of the impacts of alternative management policies on water resources at scales from local to global. He also works in integrated assessment and its application to the water energy food nexus, and is helping to calibrate the Global Change Assessment Model, Gcam, which you'll find out about tonight, for the climate change policy assessment in Canada. He received a PhD from the University of Western Ontario and a master's degree from the University of Waterloo. And now I'm going to pass it off to you, Evan.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Valerie. I'm going to share my screen where I have a bunch of PowerPoint slides. All right, I hope this is showing on everyone's screen. The title of my talk tonight is The Big Picture, Modeling the Global Energy System and Everything Else. So first of all, I'll talk a little bit about what systems are and what systems thinking is, and then introduce the topic of computer simulations. Then I'll talk about integrated assessment models and Gcam, which is a particular integrated assessment model that our team is using here. We'll then have a question break, and then I'll talk a little bit more specifically about Gcam Canada, give some background information on energy in Canada, and then show some case studies of Gcam application. So Gcam studies on hydropower, on the oil sands in Alberta, and on water resources. And then we'll wrap up with some conclusions at the end of the presentation. So we've all heard of systems, and we've probably thought about them at various different points. But here's a more technical definition of what a system is, at least from the perspective of my research. A system is a set of interconnected components that work together to perform a particular task or set of tasks. And so here are some examples on your screen. The first is the global hydrological system. The second is the human body. The third is an energy system. And the last is a transportation system. And so with all of these, you can see that they're made of many different parts that are all connected to perform some sort of task or set of tasks. And then systems thinking is an attempt to understand and potentially influence the behavior of a system. And so taking two of those systems as examples, we can look at the hydrological cycle, which, as you can see, comprises the entire planet. And it's a series of fluxes and storages of water in various different places on the planet. And so we can understand the hydrological system through a series of data collections. So we can collect from individual weather stations, we can collect from stream gauging stations, we can collect snow data from snow courses and various other things. And we can also do satellite measurements. And this top figure here shows you how many weather stations there actually are around the world. So there's a very large number. And once we have those stations, we can start, and once we have the data, we can start to understand the system better. And so here are all of the different river basins around the world. And we can use very complex models to simulate the flows through those rivers on a global basis. Okay, another system that we're very familiar with is the human body. And so the human body begins with organelles and cells. Those cells are grouped together to form individual organs. Organs are then grouped together to form organ systems. And so we have, for example, the respiratory system, the nervous system, the digestive system, the reproductive system, and all of these all then go together to form the human body. Okay, and that is a complex system in its own right. And to understand the human body, we can take a number of different measurements. Cardiograms and look at sleep cycles. We can also influence the behavior of the human body through medical interventions, for example, or through psychiatry, as the case may be. So then systems thinking is ultimately a reaction to the increasing complexity and interdisciplinarity of problems that society faces. And so if you think about any of the large problems that human society faces, such as climate change or COVID, or say global poverty, they're a mix of technical, environmental, social, economic, and institutional components, which makes them difficult to understand and difficult to manage. And so our aim with systems thinking is to consider the larger context or to risk other problems. And so a systems thinker will tell you that you can't just do one thing, because any action you take has consequences, whether they're intended or unintended. And so then the key questions we ask with systems thinking are, which parts and connections cause a system to behave as it does? And then how can I manipulate those parts and connections to produce a desirable outcome? So then systems and the big picture. Governments, businesses, and the public want to know the effects of their actions and their plans. Not necessarily just to know them, but to understand them and to strategize. This is, of course, difficult with complex systems. And so different options are to guess the answers, or to test various ideas, or to read research papers, conduct surveys, and various other things. They could potentially ask experts as well. Or what we'll talk about today is they can use computer models. So computer models can help us to project or even predict the future. We now use models in almost every area of government, society, the economy, business, and research. Some of these models are very simple, so they might simply be a single mathematical equation, but others are extremely complicated. And so some examples that you've probably heard of are the weather models that we use to predict the weather, hydrological models, which can be a single river basin all the way up to the global scale. They could be fluid dynamics models, which you'll see in a second. They could be agricultural models that simulate crop growth and crop yields. They could be global climate models, like the ones we use to understand climate change better. And of course, computer games are themselves simulations or computer models. Okay, so here's what these models are capable of. Okay, so the one on the left is a simulation from Stanford University. Okay, and this is called a fluid dynamics model, and you can see how complex these models are getting, how capable they are. Watch the spray from the prop at the back of the ship here. Okay, and then the video on the right is showing simulations from global climate models and projections of future climate change. Okay, so some of you may ask, what is a simulation model? And here's a nice definition from Isaac Asimov. So he says, if you want to understand some aspect of the universe, it helps if you simplify it and include only those properties and characteristics that are essential for understanding. If you want to determine how an object drops, you don't concern yourself with whether it's new or old, is red or green, or has an odor or not. You eliminate those things and thus do not needlessly overcomplicate matters. This simplification you call a model or a simulation, and you present it either as an actual representation on a computer screen or as a mathematical relationship. Such simplified simulations make it far easier to grasp a phenomenon than it would be if we had to study the phenomenon itself. Okay, so that's what a simulation model is. It's a simplification of reality so that we can understand the outcomes of actions a little bit better. One particular type of model is an integrated assessment model. So integrated assessment models, or IAMs, simulate alternative futures under climate and other large-scale changes. These models are quite complicated, so they include a number of different global sectors. They include the energy system, the land use system, agriculture, buildings, water, and climate and emissions, and the linkages between all of these different systems as well. So here you can see an image that breaks down some of the components of these types of models. There's quite a large number of them in existence, and the one that we're using for our research is called Gcam, so I'll describe that a little bit later. Okay, but these are some of the typical types of components that integrated assessment models include. Another definition of an integrated assessment model is a tool that captures the complex interactions and interdependencies across the natural and human systems and across spatial and temporal scales for a wide range of uses including improving the science of fine-scale impact analysis, multi-stakeholder policymaking, and the development of adaptation strategies. And so again, you can see that they're made up of many different components, some of which are climate related. So we have weather and so on here, and then non-climate related influences. So things like infrastructure or changes in demand, changes in technology, market forces and population dynamics, and so on. IAMs can be used to answer a number of different questions. And some of these might include, for example, how might emerging technologies like photovoltaic cells or new batteries influence how energy is consumed and used? What might these changes mean for greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, international markets for fossil fuels, and access to energy? How might changes in population, income, or technology cost alter crop production, energy demand, or water withdrawals? How do changes in one region's demand for energy affect energy, water, and land in other regions? And what are the effects of these changes in general and more specifically, both now and potentially up to 100 years from now? The model, again, that we're using is one of these integrated assessment models. It's called the Global Change Analysis Model, or Gcam. This is a well-known open source community integrated assessment model. And what all these terms mean is, in terms of well-known, it's one of the probably 6 major integrated assessment models in the world. These are developed by large teams in different countries around the world. So some of them include the message model, which is developed in Austria, the image model, which is developed in the Netherlands, AIM, which is developed in Japan, and so on. Gcam is developed by the Joint Global Change Research Institute in College Park, Maryland. When we say it's open source, what we mean is that it is actually free to download for anyone who would like to use it. The learning curve is pretty steep, but if you want to download it, you are free to do so. And when it says community, that means that it's researchers all over the world who contribute to its development. Okay, so again, Gcam is the model our research team is using. And our research team is made up of researchers at the University of Alberta, at GIGCRE, and at Environment and Climate Change Canada. So at the U of A, we have Diego Chiapori and Osama Yunus, who are both PhD students, Evan Arbuckle, who's a master's student, and Ray Xing, who was a PDF or a postdoctoral fellow who worked with us for about 2 years. At GIGCRE, we have Matthew Binstead and Candelaria Bergero, and a few others as well. And then Mohammed Shahid Siddiqui and Nick Macaluso at ECCC. And I'd like to acknowledge the support as well of Future Energy Systems through the CFREF, or Canada First Research Excellence Fund, and ECCC for supporting the research. All right, so a little bit more detail on Gcam. Gcam simulates energy, land, water, socioeconomic, and climate systems and their linkages. So there are 32 different regions in the model. These include all of the regions you can see here on the top left. So some of them are individual nations, others are groups of nations. And so we have Canada, the United States, China, then all of Europe, and then India and 27 other countries and regions. The energy sector includes electric power plants and renewables, fossil fuels, as well as the end uses in buildings and industry. The agricultural component exists on this land component here. And so it represents the production of food, feed, and livestock, both on rain-fed land and on irrigated land. The water sector includes both supply at a river basin scale. So there are 235 different river basins included in the model in terms of the hydrology, and the demands, which may be for municipal purposes, industrial or agricultural purposes, are also represented at that river basin scale. Then the climate and emissions component are the releases of, I can't remember the number, I think it's 12 different greenhouse gas types or species, and the associated changes in temperature. And then the model runs from 2015 through to 2100 in 5-year time steps. And so to give you an idea of the different connections between components, here are the major energy pathways in Gcam. So you can see from resource production, we have oil production, bioenergy, coal, natural gas, and uranium. We then have some transformations that exist, so refining, gas processing, and of course we have electricity production. And then we have the final energy carriers, which are either liquids like oil or diesel, bioenergy, coal, natural gas, or electricity. And then all of these energy carriers provide the energy that's required by the buildings on the planet in each of these different regions, the industrial sector, which is broken into manufacturing and power generation, and the transportation sector as well. So then a little bit more technical information here. How does Gcam actually work? It works on the basis of a series of representative agents that use information on market prices and technology costs, as well as some other factors, to decide on the allocations of resources. So we have a number of different locations where you'll find agents. They exist in the regional electricity market, in the refining sector, in the energy demand sector, in land use, and particularly in agriculture, and all of those different crops that are produced, both for human food and for animal feed. There are also land cover components, which are related to natural forests or pasture lands, grasslands, tundra, and so on, and then various other sectors as well. These agents all interact through markets, and so they pass both the supply that's available of these different types, as well as the demand for the different goods and services into the markets. Gcam then solves for the market prices that balance the supplies with the demands for all of these different markets. And the calculations that are done are just for the particular time period we're in. So the model does not optimize over the future, it just looks at where we are right now in this five-year time period. Okay, and then when it's run all of those calculations, the state of the world at the end of the current 5-year period is the starting point for the next period. And so Gcam will account for things like resource depletion, capital stock retirements, so for example, the elimination of coal-fired power plants, and installations, so for example, the production of a new hydropower plant or a new natural gas-fired power plant, changes to the landscape that go along with conversion of land to agricultural purposes or urbanization, emissions to the atmosphere, and so on. Now, the way that the students and I typically interact with the Gcam are through what's called Gcam Data. And so a lot of the work with our project so far has been basically processing the data to produce a Gcam Canada version of the model. And I'll get into that component a little bit later. But just to give you an idea of the flow, we access data from StatCan, for example, and Statistics Canada data provide us with the raw information we need. R codes, so R is a computer language. R codes then filter all of that information and then turn it into tables that Gcam can use. Then once those data are reshaped into another set of CSV files, a second layer of R code links all of the data sources or data sets so that they can be input into the Gcam model. and they're input in the form of another type of computer output, which are called XML files. And so those XML files are the input to the Gcam model. Some of the XML files are from these two earlier stages. Other ones are to set up individual model scenarios that we want to run. And then finally, when we have all of this input ready, then we run the model itself. And the model uses those XML files to run in C++, and then it produces output files in the form of tables. And it loads those into a database that we can access with the results. Okay, and I've alluded to this or mentioned the topic of scenarios before. The way that we run Gcam is through a set of scenarios. These are individual model simulations, and their aim is to show the results of various what-if questions. So some of the scenarios we use in Gcam could be used in common across many different integrated assessment models. And these include things like RCPs and SSPs. So you've probably noticed by now there are a lot of acronyms. Here are a few more acronyms. RCPs are representative concentration pathways, and SSPs are shared socioeconomic pathways. And they just look like this. So they're trends over time. So RCPs, as I said, are representative concentration pathways, and they are simulated by various different integrated assessment modeling groups. And they provide greenhouse gas forcings to climate models. So those GCMs, like you saw in one of the animations earlier in the presentation. The most extreme case is RCP 8.5. So this is the most significant climate change trend line. This is a more moderate case of climate change. And then RCP 2.6 is a relatively lower forcing that drives warming in the climate system. The SSPs are shared socioeconomic pathways, and they're developed by integrated assessment modeling groups as well. And what they do is they provide a set of socioeconomic assumptions that are used to run the IAMs. And they're very useful for a number of different purposes, but one of the reasons for them is to provide a common basis for comparison across different models. So you can say, for example, the AIM team and the image and the Gcam teams are all going to run SSP5, and they're going to see how the results differ. Okay, and so if you look at this figure here, what it's showing you is challenges for society to adapt to climate change and challenges for society to mitigate amounts of climate change. And so the idea with SSP5 is that this is a very rich, very technical society that can adapt quite easily, but drives a lot of change. And so they need to mitigate. Sorry, I think I've got that. Do I have that right? As you can see, it's complicated. What I will say, I guess, to make it a bit simpler, is SSP1 is the most sustainable future. So it's the sort of green future where things turn out very well. SSP5 is a rich society that doesn't care particularly about larger environmental problems in the world. They can always just keep things locally quite acceptable. SSP2 is sort of a business as usual or reference case. SSP3 is where population grows really significantly, and so they really have a lot of trouble adapting to the changes as well as mitigating the changes. And so this is sort of the hellish situation here. And then SSP4 is very regionalized. And so there are some regions that are quite able to adapt to the changes, and others that aren't. And so it's a rich and poor sort of situation. Other scenarios are really more topic specific. So they don't have to be RCPs and SSPs that are run with the integrated assessment models. Instead, some may address things like national climate policies, so the effects of various different carbon taxation levels. In Canada, the phase out of coal-fired power plants, emissions caps that could be put on things, or clean fuel standards. We could also look at technology costs, so the effects of regional differences in geothermal energy costs or hydroelectric power plants. Alternative projected costs, where we assume that some of the new technologies are relatively cheaper or more expensive. What are the outcomes? Or sort of uncertainty analyses, where we adjust different coefficient values or constant values in the models. And so some examples of where we've applied that type of analysis are for alternative water demands for different electricity power plants, for example. And so there are different cooling technologies that are used to cool power plants. And in some cases, we don't know exactly what the values should be. Should they be, relatively higher or relatively lower than an average value? And we can run these kinds of scenarios to see how much those differences actually matter for how much water is actually used by a different region or country. Okay, and then when we run our scenarios through the models, we get this database of results, and the output that we usually see will be in the form of graphs. So these graphs can show changes in model variables over time, so changes from 2015 through 2100, and so they might look like this, for example, and you'll see this graph again a little bit later in the presentation, so I'll explain more about it then. Or they could be maps. So here's 2050 and 2100, and I can see the results of different policies at different times. The simulation results can, of course, be displayed in many other ways as well. And the data that these scenarios generate can also be used as input to other models. So as I was saying, those RCPs are used as input to the global climate models, or they can be used for other analyses entirely. All right, so that's sort of the introductory material. I'll take a break here to answer any questions, and then in the next set, I'll talk about how we're actually using Gcam.
Wonderful. I feel like I'm learning so much about your work after I think we've worked together for like a year and a half, and I'm learning so much more now. We have a question from the audience. What makes this model, Gcam, different from many other models out there?
That's a good question. The answer is they're all different, and they're all different in different ways. And so sometimes it's the way in which the model works. So this is a market-based model. It makes decisions based on supply and demand. Other models are much more physically based, so they'll take those economic variables as inputs to drive changes in physical systems. Other models are actually optimization based, and so they'll optimize over multiple time periods. Some models have more regions than others, and so Gcam has 32 regions. Some of them have, in the sort of 10 to 15 region range. Let's see. Well, I guess that's probably enough information, but they are all different in essentially different ways. Different assumptions, different representations of their sectors, and different types of linkages between the different sectors as well.
Okay. The next question we have is a bit more technical. I hope I say it correctly. Do we need to enter data directly into the model interface, or do we need to run C++ language before one can use the model?
Okay, so when you execute the model, when you run the model, it first of all reads in all the data itself. Then it does all of these market balancings. So it optimizes the markets in each individual time step, and that's an iterative procedure. So it first of all comes up with one value of supply and figures out what the demand is and whether they balance, If it doesn't, it adjusts a little bit, runs again, and it does that potentially hundreds of times until it gets all of those markets to balance. But ultimately, the model handles all of the data input itself, but you need to give it the data. So you need to show it where the data are, and then it'll read them in. Then it produces its output to another XML database.
Okay, I hope that answers the question that John asked. Another question is, what are your suggestions to help someone start their journey on systems thinking and life cycle of systems?
That's a good question. There's some very good books written by a team of researchers at MIT. If you look up Dana Meadows or Donella Meadows, she wrote a series of newspaper columns. I can't remember when it was, in the 80s, perhaps, or early 90s. And so that's a really good sort of launching off point for thinking about systems. She was a very good communicator, and these newspaper columns were intended for the general audience. So that's a good place to start. Looking up some papers by Forrester, by a man named Jay Forrester, might also help, or John Sturman, also at MIT. So that's a decent enough area or place to start, I think.
Great, thank you for those suggestions. Will it be possible to use the model to compare energy, food, water nexus at the same time?
Yeah, and actually that is something that we've done. So one of the first roles I played in the Gcam model development was in working with people at Gcam to look at the water energy nexus. So we started out with looking at connections between water and energy, and then we looked at connections between water and agriculture. And so I think, I can't remember, but I don't believe we've looked at the water energy food nexus specifically, but we've looked at component parts of it.
Okay, we have so many great questions coming in. I think we'll do the two that are in the chat and then give you time to do the rest of the presentation. And any more that come up, we will ask at the end.
Sure.
The next one's a bit long. Since the model includes the impact of population growth, how does the model include the expansion of energy infrastructure, like power transmission lines, to permit the increase in energy use? Does it assume all incremental infrastructure is built, or does it account for public opposition to infrastructure and limit incremental infrastructure?
So basically all decisions are economic. It is possible to include something like public opposition to certain developments. It's done in a sort of workaround way, I guess you could say. Yeah, I don't want to get too technical, but there are settings in the model called share weights, and they determine how evenly supply is spread out. So if a share weight is 1 for all of your different parameters, for all of your different options, then that means, for example, if I were trying to decide between hydropower, natural gas, wind, solar, and all of their share weights were 1, then the decision would be purely economic, which one is cheapest. But if I want to represent something like public opposition to coal-fired power plants, what I can do is decrease the share weight. So I can make the share weight more like 0.2, which means that it's much less likely that any demand for power would be distributed to coal. It would be spread across the other ones, primarily that have the higher share weights. In terms of the infrastructure components, the model is not really detailed in the sense of showing all of that infrastructure. So it isn't like a Google Earth sort of map where you can see where things are. Instead, it's just sort of like individual points on the map. And so Ontario, for example, is a point. Alberta is a point. The United States is a point as well. And so any infrastructure that needs to be built is just built. It's some way is found of putting it in there. But again, there could be some sort of opposition to that infrastructure built in through something like a share weight.
And when you're deciding those share weights, is it decided, for example, as the researcher, would you determine those share weights, or would it be, again, is it data that you can find, or how do those get decided?
Yeah, it's part of the calibration procedure. So the model will find those share weights itself. But for future projections, we can adjust the share weights. So for historical, it looks at the prevalence of different technologies to decide what those share weights probably were. But if, for example, we want to phase out coal-fired power plants, we could, it's not the best way, but we could change those share weights. A better way is just to use a carbon taxation policy, for example, to drive them down. Or I think in Canada, because of the coal-fired power plant phase out, it probably is done through share weights. But my grad students would know more about the particulars of that than I do.
Okay. The last question for now. Systems are not isolated. They overlap with other systems. When a change is made in one system, does the model adjust the other related systems?
That's not as straightforward an answer as you would expect, because the model has a certain solution approach that starts with one sector and sort of ripples those effects through the other sectors. So yes, there are connections, and that's one of the advantages of the integrated assessment model, but you have to be careful about what you could call simultaneous problems, where you're adjusting too much at the same time. And so, yeah, so there are feedbacks, and certainly they're important, but they're solved in a particular way to avoid crashing the machine. The other thing I should mention is things like population change or economic development are actually inputs to the model. So the model doesn't simulate how the population changes over time. It takes those as a set of drivers. And those drivers are specified in the SSPs, for example, or in the different policies.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for the amazing questions. I can't wait to see what questions we get at the end as well. I'm going to hand this back over to you to continue presenting.
Sure. All right. Yes, thank you for the questions. I'll now talk about our specific project. And so the project objective is the development of a 13-region Gcam Canada regional model for future energy scenario analysis. And so our first step is to prepare Gcam Canada to support decision-making for new energy and environmental policies, to identify promising national, provincial, and corporate strategies, and to compare different outcomes. Now, more specifically, we'll apply Gcam Canada to questions related to oil sands development, renewable energy options, and potentially industrial development. And then in the longer term, we're hoping to apply Gcam Canada to questions related to land use, agriculture, and water resources. And so the examples I'll show you are using just a single national region for Gcam Canada, because the 13-region Gcam Canada model that has all of the different provinces broken out, as well as the territories, isn't quite done yet. So it will be finished, we think, by May 2021, so a few months from now. It's almost finished. The only part that needs completion is the electric sector, and that's one of the complicated ones. A little bit of background on Canadian energy systems so that you have some context for what we're doing. our energy supplies from many different sources. Some of these are primary sources and they're used directly. So things like natural gas, oil, and coal may be used as energy sources in industry without conversion first to electricity, for example. Others are used as secondary sources, so this would be through electricity generation. And so when you look at this graph here, which shows how much the energy supply has increased over the last 30 years, we have oil, which is used primarily for transportation. We have hydro, which is of course electricity. Then we have natural gas, some of which is burned directly in our houses, in our furnaces, and some of which is converted into electricity first. And then coal is sort of the same. So some of it is used for electricity generation. In Canada, that's almost all of it. And some of it is also used as a direct heating source. And then nuclear, of course, is all for electricity production as well. Electricity generation itself differs really significantly across provinces, which reinforces the value of having a 13-region Gcam Canada model. And so if we look at electricity generation by source for Canada, 60% of our electricity comes from hydroelectric power. About 7% comes from coal, 15% comes from nuclear, 11% is from natural gas and oil, and 7% is from renewable energy sources. But if you look at the different provinces and territories, the electricity system is very different. And so British Columbia is almost entirely hydropower. Alberta, in contrast, is quite heavily coal, with a fair bit of natural gas and a growing amount of natural gas, some wind as well. And then Saskatchewan is even more significantly coal. And then if we look at Quebec, it's again primarily hydropower. Ontario has a lot of nuclear, and so on. The other thing I'll mention is these are the past values, and anything to the right of this red line is future projections. This is from the Canada Energy Regulator, which used to be the National Energy Board. Now, of interest in Alberta, of course, is oil sands. And so here's a reference scenario for Alberta. So you can see how significantly oil production has grown over the last decade. And then the question is how much it will grow into the future. Here's one projection, again from the Canada Energy Regulator. And here's an entirely different projection from a year later. Okay, and so you can see this is their evolving scenario, and this is their business as usual or reference scenario. And so the difference in these scenarios will have implications for Alberta, you know, depending on which of these comes to pass, as well as effects for the rest of the country as well. And what we're hoping is that with Gcam, we'll be able to run scenarios like this. And of course, energy demands have also risen over the past 30 years in the different sectors of the economy. So here are industrial demands, here are the transport demands, residential, commercial and public services, and non-energy uses. Okay, so that's a little bit about energy systems in Canada. We'll look now at a specific example run with Gcam that focuses on hydropower production to 2050. And so as you've seen, hydropower produces 60% of the Canadian electricity supply, and the capacity is expanding. However, there have been significant cost overruns that have occurred for several large hydropower projects under development in Canada. These include Muskrat Falls in Newfoundland and Labrador, Kiask, which is in Manitoba, and Site C, which is in British Columbia. And such cost overruns are also common elsewhere in the world. And so we were interested in looking at some of the implications of these cost overruns. In Gcam, hydropower has historically just been modeled as what's called a fixed output. So you just set it up as one of the scenario inputs, and it's not responsive to markets. It just produces a certain amount of hydroelectric power, in each time frame of the model simulation. So in other words, hydroelectric generation was preset for each of the scenarios. But in a country like Canada, where 60% of our power is from hydro, we are concerned about what the future looks like, and the different policies and effects that can drive changes in the amount of hydropower. Another important consideration is because it was a fixed output, it didn't contribute to a region's modeled electricity price. And so the model, again, is a market-based model. It does produce a price for electricity. And so any electricity price came from solar, wind, geothermal, coal-fired power plants, and natural gas-fired power plants, for example. And the electricity price from hydropower just wasn't factored in. So then what we did was we represented hydropower as an endogenous component of the model. So now it's a market-based decision. So then our question is, how does capturing the cost of hydropower capacity expansion affect its share of Canada's electricity generation over time? That was our first question. The second was, how does the endogenous modeling, so the internal feedback-based modeling of hydropower, affect the electrification of end-use sectors? So industries, buildings, transportation, and so on. And how does the inclusion of historically observed cost overruns, because these mega projects are subject to quite often quite significant cost overruns, for Canadian hydropower plants, affect electricity production and the end-use sectors? And so the research we conducted was recently published in a journal called Energy Policy. Here's the first page. Here's the list of authors. And so you'll see here there are people from U of A, people from GCRI, and people from ECCC. And I need to read you a disclaimer here as well, which is that the views and opinions expressed in that paper are those of the authors alone and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of ECCC or the Government of Canada. The methods that we use were to, first of all, create hydropower as a resource and as a technology that can compete in the market in Gcam. Our hydropower supply curve information came from an earlier study conducted by people also at GCRI. And that's this set of results here, which you can see is GIS based. So it's a very detailed global map of these different resources. And then we had to make assumptions about technology characteristics. So costs, capacity factors, which means how much fraction of the time these power plants are actually run, which can range from, say, 90% of the time down to about 10% of the time. And those assumptions came from Environment and Climate Change Canada. And then we ran scenarios with increased capital costs that were based on the literature of historical overruns. Okay, and so one of the first sets of results was, this is the fixed case where hydropower was just set up at the beginning to be a certain amount over the entire simulation run and was not responsive to energy markets or anything. And so this is what that sort of reference scenario looked like. This is what happened as soon as we included hydropower as an endogenous variable in the simulation runs. You can see that hydropower became much more common into the future. Okay, so there was a lot more hydropower production in the endogenous case. Then we looked at various different cost overrun scenarios. And so we simulated the effects of various different levels of cost overruns, which came from the literature. And so there were some cases where there were sort of mid-levels of overruns, high overrun cases, which added 53% to the base cost, and then extreme overruns, which doubled the costs. Then we looked at various different technologies that were affected. So we compared where only hydro was affected versus where all of these other either new technologies or overrun prone technologies were included with cost overruns. And so nuclear, for example, is quite prone to cost overruns as well. And you can see that their overruns are historically even larger than hydropower, whereas the other ones are slightly less. And so here are some of the results. You can see here whether it's the mid or the high or the extreme case on the left-hand side of each of these simulation runs. And then on the right-hand side, circled in blue, you can see whether it's just hydropower that's affected or whether it's multiple different technologies. And what you should note is, in terms of results, the cost overruns decreased the hydropower production or hydropower generation over time, and any other overrun prone or multi technologies. Okay, and that's shown here. So notice the difference between just having hydro affected by overruns and having all of these different technologies affected. You can see that the amount of nuclear in particular here is reduced. And the other interesting thing that happens is the cost overruns also decreased the electricity generation or the demand for electricity in all of the end use sectors. So the demands were met through thermal fuels instead, things like coal, oil, and natural gas. Okay, and you can see just how much change there is. This is a flat line, and so you can see there's a gap here. And so what happened there was what's called fuel switching. The demand shifted from electricity because it became relatively more expensive to other fuel sources like biomass, which is, say, burning crops or wood or different biomass sources. Not much change to coal, but change also to natural gas. And in some cases, not in these here, it could have been to hydrogen and then to liquids like oil, for example. And you can see that electricity decreased in all of these cases. And to put these numbers in perspective, we're talking about fairly small shifts. This is in exajoules, which is 10 to the 15 joules. And we have 0.2 exajoules here, where Canada consumed about 14 exajoules total in 2019. So they're not large shifts, but there are shifts. So then in terms of conclusions, one very nice effect of this study is Gcam can now simulate hydropower endogenously as a market variable. And that's very important for Canada in particular, but also for other nations like, say, Norway or Brazil, or potentially even places like China that are developing a lot more hydropower. Another point is that capturing cost overruns significantly affected hydropower development. And finally, hydropower expansion may not actually drive significant reductions in economy-wide CO2 emissions because of higher electricity costs and then the corresponding fuel switching that you saw. Okay, so policies may not work exactly the way we think is what this means. So policies to electrify. A second study that is of particular interest for Alberta, of course, is oil sands projections with Gcam. This is unfortunately work that's still in progress. We have a paper abstract accepted and a full paper that's to be submitted to a special issue in a journal called Energy Strategy Reviews for July of this year. Our focus in that paper is on more detailed modeling of the Canadian oil sands in Gcam. And we've broken out a number of different technologies. So until this point, Gcam has just modeled oil sands production as unconventional energy. And there's no technological detail or anything in the model. And so we've broken out different parts of the extraction process, which is related to oil sands mining, or SAGD, which is steam-assisted gravity drainage. And so that's used, that's where steam is injected under the ground. It causes the oil sands to melt and form a liquid that can then be pumped out. that in both cases, the oil sands product can be upgraded to form synthetic crude oil, and then it can be refined into the kind of gasoline that we can burn in our car engines. Okay, and so there's a different range of climate change policies in Canada that we're going to simulate, whether they're more or less stringent, and in the rest of the world. So what would happen, for example, if Canada adopted a very stringent climate change policy and the rest of the world didn't do very much at all? Okay, so those are the types of scenarios that we'll analyze in that study. And then some other work that I've been involved in personally relates to global water resources in Gcam. So I've been working with researchers at GCRE since 2009 on questions related to world water resources. I've worked with people including Mohammed Hijazi, Neil Graham, Paige Kyle, Sunny Kim, Kate Calvin, Leon Clark, Jay Edmonds, and others. And I'll talk briefly about 3 recent studies that we've published. The first is looking at including water in the shared socioeconomic pathways. The second is looking at drivers of water scarcity into the future. And it turns out that it's us, humanity, who are the key drivers of water scarcity rather than climate change. And then some future projections of the global virtual water trade, which I'll explain in a few slides as well. So first then, how does the amount of water society uses change over time? The SSPs that I described earlier were developed without any assumptions for water resources. So they focused on socioeconomic changes, changes in the energy system and the agricultural system and so on, but they left out water. And so we developed a set of assumptions for the water sector to 2100, and they look like this. So these are the different SSPs here. You can see again, there are the high income, medium income, and low income blocks in SSP4, which I said was that sort of really disparate case. And then you can see the various different variables that are included here in this first column. So socioeconomic changes, fossil resources, electricity, fuel preferences, and so on. This is what we added to the SSPs. So water use and efficiency improvements, and then technological changes. And here are some of the sample results that we produced. It turned out, maybe not very surprisingly, that technological progress mattered a lot, but so did the underlying socioeconomic factors. And so here's SSP1, which is our sort of happy, sustainable future. Here's business as usual. Here's the sort of hell on earth situation. Here's the very different conditions from rich countries to poor countries. And here's the very technologically heavy, but not particularly environmentally concerned case. And so some of the drivers are things like global population, the amount of irrigated agriculture, and then the amount of manufacturing and electricity generation that occurs and the technologies that are associated with them, but also how much technological progress occurs makes a big difference. And you can see that particularly for SSP1. Okay, so this is the case with no technology change. And here's the case with significant technological change. And what you should notice is this is our current condition. And without any technological change, we're using still quite a bit more water in 2100. But if we have significant technological change, by 2100, we could actually be below our current water levels, our current water demands. In SSP3, this is a poor world that can't invest in technology, so there's really not much difference. And then in SSP5 again, it's once again a rich society, and so it can invest in technology, and so water use really decreases. And just to put these numbers in context, we're looking here at global water withdrawals. Water withdrawals are the amount of water that's removed from surface water bodies, so rivers and lakes, and potentially from groundwater as well for human purposes. Some of that will be what's called consumed. If it's consumed, it's incorporated into agricultural production. So the crops use it as they grow and they evaporate it from the river basin. That's called consumption. And then what is not consumed gets returned into the surface water bodies. Okay, and it'll then flow downstream for other uses downstream. So again, what we're looking at are the withdrawals, the amount of water that's taken out and then used. Some of it will be consumed, some of it will be put back. And here we're talking about billions of cubic meters, which is cubic kilometers. Okay, so 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer of water. And the maximum value you'll see here is somewhere around 7,000 cubic kilometers of water is what society is using in sort of the worst case scenario here. We're not entirely sure how much water is flowing through lakes and rivers on an annual basis, but it's probably somewhere around 37,000. So if we're using 7,000 of that for human purposes, that's quite a large fraction of the total. And this neglects any sort of pollution effects that our use has. Okay, so this is just raw water use, not even worrying about how we pollute the water as we use it. All right, so that's the first study. The second study looked at what drives water scarcity into the future. Water scarcity is common in many different regions of the world, and it affects human welfare as well as agricultural and economic production. And so we wanted to know, how does scarcity change into the future? Secondly, are the changes in scarcity caused by changes in human demands, or are they caused by changes in climate? And so here are some general results. Again, we're looking at the various different SSPs. And what you should notice here is that a plus sign means the changes in society increase scarcity, and a minus means that changes in either climate or human factors drive a decrease in scarcity. And so what you'll notice is in most cases, there's an increase in scarcity, and they're almost all caused by people, not by climate change. In fact, in many ways, increasing climate change actually decreases scarcity because we get more extreme rainfalls and various other things. Okay, so these are the SSP scenarios. Then we were wondering regionally where these changes occur. And so we ran many different SSP and RCP combinations to try to figure out in these various different river basins whether the drivers were predominantly human or climate. And you can see in almost all basins, it's humans who are causing the change, not climate. There are a few cases, for example, that are green where it's climate driven, but again, the vast majority of this map is red, so human caused. And notice too, this is 2050 and 2100. So we're looking 30 years and then 80 years into the future. And I should mention, this is not showing magnitude of change, it's just showing cause of change. So some of these basins may not have very much change at all, and others may have very significant changes. We're not showing that. We're just showing where they are, where those changes, whether they're large or small, are. Okay, that's our second study. And then the third, which was published last year as well, is how much embedded water moves around the world into the future. And so currently water-stressed regions will import water-intensive goods. And this is called the trade of virtual water. The idea here is that it's hard for Saudi Arabia, for example, to grow a lot of wheat. If they wanted to grow wheat, they would have to tap into their groundwater aquifers and deplete them. And so it makes a lot more sense, for example, for India or Canada or say China or the United States to grow that wheat and then export it to Saudi Arabia, which then buys it. Okay, and so the water that's embedded in the production of that crop is called virtual water. And so this topic of virtual water has received increasing interest over the last probably 15 years. And the current values are reasonably well known, but there really aren't any projections for virtual water trade into the future. And so that's what we developed. So here are some results. These are results for 2050 and for 2100, and they show virtual green water exports in very large units, so 40 billion cubic kilometers or 40 cubic kilometers, up to 50. And so individual river basins here are exporting 50 cubic kilometers of water in a year. Okay, and when we talk about green water, what we're talking about is rain-fed crops. So this is just the water that naturally falls over these crops and allows them to grow. And then they're harvested and exported to other countries. Blue water is in the second set of maps here. So again, these are for 2050 and for 2100. And blue water means irrigated crops. And so this is water that's being diverted from rivers into reservoirs, and then from reservoirs into irrigation systems and sprinkled over the crops to help them grow. And so in this case, we're looking at smaller volumes, but still a maximum of about 5 cubic kilometers of water being exported from basins like this one. Okay, so very significant volumes of water are being traded in agricultural goods, both now and into the future. And then we also looked at some of the importers and exporters regionally of virtual water. And so here you can see the virtual water trade fluxes by water source. So here's green water with the green background and blue water with the blue background. There was also a groundwater component, but I'm not very interested in groundwater, so I cropped it out. But it is there if you want to see it. It's in that paper. And you'll see here positive values are exports and negative values are imports. Okay, so here are our negatives, here are our positive, or rather, here are our negatives, here are our positives. And then the various different crop types are also represented. So we have biomass, corn, fiber crops, fodder crops for animals, miscellaneous crops, which are things like fruits and vegetables and so on, oil crops like canola, grain crops that are not wheat, wheat, rice, or corn, but say barley and rye and oats and so on, palm fruits, rice, roots and tubers, so potatoes and sweet potatoes and taro and various others, sugar crops, and then wheat. And you can see here's Canada. We're potentially exporting quite a lot of water in the form of biomass by 2100. And then secondarily, oil crops and wheat. But we're not exporting actually very much blue water at all. Whereas interestingly, China is exporting quite large amounts of blue water. And the reason for that is their population has decreased. So they reach a maximum population sometime before 2050, and then their population declines over the remainder of the 21st century. Okay, and that leaves them available or able to export water or export crops. All right, so in terms of conclusions, we can predict the future with computer models. Models like Gcam help us to weigh our options, and they help us to see how local and global effects of, or rather they help us to see the local and global effects of our energy, water, land use, and climate policy choices now, and all the way into our grandchildren's or great-grandchildren's lives. And so you can also see from these various different scenarios, our choices do matter. And so depending on what our priorities are, we can actually make a difference. And here are some websites that have related information for people who want to follow up on some of these topics. So you can look up Gcam and GIGCRE. You can look up the Canada Energy Regulator and some of the energy future projections. You can look up more about integrated assessment models. through the Integrated Assessment Modeling Consortium. And some of the papers I mentioned are posted on my website here, so you can access those as well. Okay, so thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Evan. I know everyone at home is clapping wildly, but all of their mics are off, so you just get to hear me and see some faces clapping. Thank you, everyone. That was a wonderful talk. We did get a few more questions popping in, and then I have a couple myself as well. So if anyone does have any questions, pop them in the chat, or you can come online and ask yourself. But the first one we got was, can your models, or is your goal to work with organizations, governments, to provide advice for dealing with some of these issues? For example, with cost overruns and hydropower, can you model strategies to reduce fuel switching? I know one person asked in the chat about using carbon tax as a way to reduce that fuel switching. Is that a goal of this kind of modeling?
Yeah, it can certainly be done. And so ECCC is very interested in using the Gcam Canada regional model once it's finished. Gcam in the United States has been used by a number of large multinational corporations. It's also used by the US DOE, Department of Energy, by the Environmental Protection Agency, and so on. In Canada, our model isn't yet ready, so we haven't really done a lot of searching for partners yet, but it certainly will be ready by a couple of months from now. And then definitely we'd be interested in working with provincial agencies. I have a way of tracking interest in papers through ResearchGate, which is listed here. And so I know that, for example, people from BC Hydro and Hydro-Quebec have actually looked at our paper that's on cost overruns and so on, and we'd be happy to work with them. Evan Arbuckle, one of my master's students who did a lot of that work on the hydropower projections, I think is online as well. And he's currently working on developing resource curves for individual river basins in Canada, so that can be used at a regional scale by agencies like BC Hydro or Ontario Hydro, or other groups as well.
Wonderful. So it's going to be an exciting year over the next little while. Fingers crossed. We got some questions about COVID and how it is related to Gcam. So based on the 5-year update kind of system, 2020 would kind of be the next year of that 5-year switch. How is COVID expected to influence that, especially with the future changes to a lot more people working at home, potentially less driving, current changes in flight patterns? How does COVID and Gcam kind of go together?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and one to which we don't really have an answer yet. Gcam works best with averages. And so when we look at 2015 as a calibration year or 2010 as a calibration year, what we're really hoping is that things don't change a lot from, say, 2009 through to 2011, so that 2010 is a really representative year. But 2020 is a really unrepresentative year. And so the jury is still out on how we'll deal with that. One option, of course, is to take things at face value and just put in the 2020 values. But that will definitely bias how the model works into the future. And so do we then want to do something very atypical, which would be looking at an average of 2018 through to, say, 2023, and use that as the 2020 base that we can calibrate from? And yeah, I mean, fortunately, we don't have to deal with this for several years. We just did a base year update to 2015, and that was done in 2020. And part of the reason is it actually takes these data gathering organizations and institutions multiple years to process the data to figure out what actually happened in 2015. And so it's not a matter of, getting to December 31st, 2015, and then having all the 2015 data. It can take up until about 2018 before you have those data.
Wow. So an interesting next decade to figure out, is 2020 going to be the new kind of normal as we go into the next era of where people work and how people travel and how that influences how we use energy and water and everything.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, we have a few more questions. Does the Gcam model allow determining possible optimization in infrastructure? For example, could it suggest the same hydropower production be done with smaller dams that have less of an effect on the environment? So can it provide that advice to companies, or is it more of a big picture?
Generally speaking, it's a big picture model. It is possible to represent different technologies within a group, though. And so as an example, we could simulate the mega projects for hydropower. And we could also make a separate technology that would be run-of-river type generation. And potentially, if there's enough to differentiate it, we could make medium-size power plants. The problem would be that Gcam does not actually represent each power plant individually. What it does is it represents a total capacity at sort of a basin scale or a regional scale or even a national scale. So it just represents the total number of gigawatts that are installed rather than where the plants are and so on. Although there is some representation of the details of power plants now because of what's called vintaging. So it actually keeps track of, how much capacity was installed in various different time periods for retirement and so on.
And I guess in a way, you could maybe bring in that idea of share weight that you talked about earlier. If you're able to distinguish those different sizes and the impacts of them related to the environmental impacts, similar to how you were talking about coal earlier. Awesome. From the model or your observation, what activities by humans are causing this water scarcity that you talked about in your last section?
Yeah, good question. It depends on where you are in the world. In a lot of cases, it's primarily agricultural, so it's irrigation demand. And that's important in places like China and India and Africa. In other places, say North America, it's actually more industrial demand. And so that's for power plants. Power plants, the thermal power plants burn coal or they burn natural gas, and they require cooling, or they use steam turbines. Okay, so it's really the cooling process though that requires a lot of water, and that's to cool the steam when it exits from the turbine. Some technologies require a lot of water withdrawal, and others require very little withdrawal, but they consume almost everything that they withdraw. And so if you've seen those parabolic cooling towers around some of the big power plants, that's the cooling tower. And so it consumes a lot, but it doesn't withdraw very much. And so because our power plants are older in large part in North America, they use this withdrawal heavy cooling approach. Whereas in a lot of areas of the world where electrification is newer, they're using the cooling towers instead. And so their industrial uses are lower.
Again, bringing in that regional perspective really plays a role because it is so variable location to location.
Yeah, it is.
Can this model be used to model transmission or distribution grids or microgrids as we're moving towards this microgrid energy system?
That's a good question. I don't believe it models very much of anything related to a grid. The assumption currently is whatever electricity is produced is used. and how it gets to those end use sectors is not really modeled. That said, it does include storage. So you can have some of the renewable power sources like wind or solar installed with storage. You can have pumped hydro potentially as well. But the grid as such is not represented as an infrastructural component.
Okay, and I think this will be our last question. Can you share some of the unexpected feedback or connected effects that you've seen in these models? What were you surprised by, didn't expect to see in the 100 years from now version when you input that data?
Well, I certainly didn't expect to see people were responsible for so much of the scarcity. I thought that climate would play a larger role and that it would be almost entirely negative. And it turns out that in a lot of cases, climate change actually decreases scarcity. So that was unexpected. I was also surprised by how much the technological change actually mattered for some of those SSPs. And much earlier on, we looked at the water energy nexus. So how much water was used for electricity production. And there's a huge range in the coefficient values that we can use. So between say 75, it's been a long time since I've looked at this, but I think it's 75 cubic meters per megawatt hour, all the way up to 180 cubic meters of water required per megawatt hour, something like that. And so that's a large range of values, and it turned out to lead to very significant differences in the amount of water that was required for power plant cooling. And so those uncertainties really mattered.
Definitely. Well, thank you again. Wild round of applause from everyone. Thank you everyone for joining us. I know we just got a couple more questions, but I want to wrap up for anyone who needs to leave. You do have questions that you didn't get answered, stick around and we'll stay on for a couple more minutes just to answer those questions. Thank you for everyone joining us tonight. We hope to see you at our next energy talk. We meet every month, the 4th Wednesday of the month. The next talk is Small but Mighty, the role of soil invertebrates to measure ecosystem recovery. And then April, we have someone coming in to talk about landowner acceptance of energy projects. And then we've got a bunch of great talks planned for the summer. So we hope to see you. Please do the survey from the library. It lets us know what you think, what you want to hear about next. Please let us know. And you can also check out more about future energy systems on our YouTube channel, our website, sign up for our newsletter. It's only once a month. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to pass it off to Cassidy to say goodbye from the library.
Thank you, Valerie, and thank you to everyone for these amazing questions, and of course, to our presenter for sharing this information. I had, you couldn't see because I had my camera off, but I had my partner peek in for a little bit because he was intrigued by what was being said. So, so as I mentioned in the chat, I will send out any of those links. There was a couple of those authors mentioned when asking about systems thinking, as well as the survey and the link to next month's energy talk. So if you missed anything, I'm sending you one last email. Other than that, I hope everyone has a wonderful evening, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you again, Evan.
Yeah, thank you all for attending as well.
Everyone stay healthy, stay safe, and we hope to see you again soon. And if you do have any questions, just stick around and we will answer them in a moment.